Good afternoon. I'm Karen Scher, Vice President of Jewish Federation of St. Louis, and on behalf of the Federation, the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Atlanta, I want to welcome you all to today's webinar, Taking to the Streets, Israeli Protests and the Reasonableness Clause, with our special guest, Michael Koplow, Chief Policy Officer at Israel Policy Forum and Senior Research Fellow of the Haga Research Center at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Before I turn the program over to Rabbi Scott Shafran, Deputy Director of JCRC, who will serve as our moderator of today's program, I want to thank Elise Picker and the JCRC for coordinating today's webinar, and welcome Rich Walter and our friends from the Jewish Federation of Greater Atlanta, with whom we share a partnership with the regions of Yokneam and Megiddo. So 6 months ago, Israel's Justice Minister informed the public about far-reaching changes to the country's judiciary. Opposition to the proposed legislation soon followed in the forms of rallies, strikes, and demonstrations on a scale previously unseen in Israel. 1 week ago, the first piece of modifying legislation applied to the Reasonableness Clause, which grants the Israeli Supreme Court the authority to apply reasonableness when evaluating government decisions and appointments. Was passed by the Israeli Knesset, a decision that has deepened an already exceedingly painful divide in Israeli society. We here at Federation and throughout North America Jewish community have been challenging ourselves with defining our role, how might we engage, and what can we do as a people committed to a Jewish and democratic Israel. Bringing programs like our webinar today, we feel is one way to keep our community engaged and in the conversation. And who better to provide deep insight and analysis than our friend Michael Koplow. So thank you, Michael, for joining us today and for all of you who are here to learn and engage. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Rabbi Scott Shafran, who will provide a brief overview of today's format and moderate today's webinar. Scott.
Thank you so much, Karen, and welcome again to everyone who is here. I'm very excited for our expert, Michael Koplow from the Israel Policy Forum, to take us through a conversation about what is going on currently in Israel and how we might interact with that and what might be coming in the future. By way of a little more introduction of Michael, he is an expert writing for Israel Policy Forum's weekly Koplow column and also editing the Israel Policy Exchange, which is a leading source of commentary and analysis on Israel and American Jewry. And his work is regularly featured in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and The Forward, among many other publications. We're very excited to have him present with us today. If you have questions as we are going along, please feel free to put them in the chat. And I'll go directly to our co-hosts and we'll try and take as many of them as we can going through. We do want to get people out of here on time at 1 o'clock and hopefully have a good conversation going forward. So welcome to Michael. I know that many of us have been following the news about these judicial reforms and the impact that they can or may have in the future for our brothers and sisters and siblings in Israel. Could you give us some background and some context for how and why these reforms were brought about in the first place?
Of course. So first of all, thank you both to St. Louis and Atlanta for hosting this conversation. And always great to be with these longtime partners of Israel Policy Forum. And thank you as well, Scott, for moderating this conversation. So this story starts back in January, 6 days after the current Netanyahu government took office. And on day number 6, Yariv Levin, the justice minister who comes from Likud, gave a press conference where he announced that the new Israeli government was going to be moving forward on a comprehensive judicial overhaul that was going to introduce a series of what he called reforms that were going to remake the role of the judiciary and the balance of power between the judiciary and the government. And there were 5 elements that he announced as part of this judicial overhaul. I will not go into every single one in great detail, but I do want to mention all 5 because I suspect that they are all going to come back around at some point. The first and most important for the government had to do with the Judicial Selection Committee, which is the body that selects judges in Israel for the Supreme Court, for the district courts, I should say, and for the magistrate courts. If people are interested, I can go into the nitty-gritty of who comprises that committee now and what the government wants to do with it. But suffice to say that the priority was to change the makeup of that committee to give the government more control over the appointment of judges. Element number 2 was about Israel's basic laws. Israel does not have a constitution. It's one of only 3 democracies in the world that does not have a constitution. The other 2 are the UK and New Zealand. Instead, it has 13 basic laws, which are meant to serve as quasi-constitutional, a quasi-constitution. They have quasi-constitutional status. That isn't actually enshrined anywhere. There is no higher threshold for passing basic laws, but the courts have treated them traditionally as if they are more important and have more weight and authority than regular legislation. And so one element of the proposed overhaul, was to say that going forward, the court would not have oversight over basic laws. Element number 3 had to do with all other types of legislation. And here the government proposed doing a number of things. One was making it harder and creating a higher threshold for the Supreme Court to overturn legislation, and also creating an override mechanism whereby if the Supreme Court were to strike down a Knesset law, the Knesset would be able to override that decision and repass the law again. Element number 4 was eliminating the reasonableness standard, which we will be talking about a lot today. The reasonableness standard does not apply to legislation. It applies to government action. So decisions taken by the cabinet or individual ministers or even municipal employees, such as mayors. The Supreme Court over time had acquired for itself this power to strike down government action if it was deemed to be extremely unreasonable. And so the 4th element was proposing that the use of the reasonableness standard be outlawed. And number 5 was about legal advisors to ministries. Legal advisors are currently appointed by the Attorney General and are bureaucrats. They're not political appointees. And what they say has the force of law. And so the 5th element was changing these legal advisors so that they would be political appointees appointed by ministers directly, and their advice would simply be advice. It would not be binding. So these were the 5 elements, and the government under Justice Minister Yariv Levin and under Simcha Rotman, who comes from the Religious Zionism Party, Hatzionut Hadatit, and he is the chair of the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee in the Knesset. Yariv Levin and Simcha Rotman began to move these things forward. And they wanted initially to have most or all of this package passed by Pesach. So that was, only a couple of months, 3 months, I guess, after the government had taken power. And the first thing they started with was judicial selection. Now, judicial selection, as I said, was the government's priority. It was the thing they cared the most about. And when they started with the Judicial Selection Committee, this brought Israelis out into the streets. And we're now, I think this was week 31, if memory serves correctly, the 31st consecutive week in which there have been protests over the overhaul. And as the overhaul moved forward through the Knesset, the protest got bigger and bigger. People will remember things came to a head last March when Defense Minister Yoav Gallant came out and said that he believed the process should be stopped so that there can be some sort of consensus. Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that he was firing Defense Minister Gallant. That created the largest protest to date. There was also a general strike called. Reservists started to say that they were not going to show up for duty. And so the process was paused for negotiations at the president's residence. Those negotiations broke down a little over a month ago. I'm happy to go into why. It's kind of long and complicated, but they broke down also having to do with the Judicial Selection Committee, at which point the government decided that it was going to proceed. And this time, rather than proceed with judicial selection, which was the most controversial element for many of the folks in the streets, they decided to proceed with what was deemed to be the least controversial element, which was the reasonableness standard. And so last Monday, 8 days ago, the Knesset passed an amendment to the basic law on judiciary, and this amendment said that going forward, neither the Supreme Court nor any other court in Israel can use the reasonableness standard as a way of striking down government action. There are a few things to know about this. One is that this applies, as I said before, to government action, not to legislation. So for any of the attorneys, any attorneys who are on this Zoom, it's similar to the arbitrary and capricious standard that federal courts use to judge agency action here in the United States. It is less well defined and it's broader, but it's the same basic idea that you're using this to strike down decisions that are made by the executive branch and not laws passed by the Knesset. So that's the first thing to know. The second thing to know is that the reasonableness standard has been applied very broadly, and it isn't used terribly often. It's been used 44 times in the last 10 years. There was a high-profile use of it actually under this government when Prime Minister Netanyahu announced after the election that he was appointing Aryeh Deri as Health and Interior Minister. The court struck that down. They viewed this appointment as extremely unreasonable because Aryeh Deri has been convicted twice and plea bargained out a third time for various crimes related to tax fraud and corruption. So we've seen it used recently. There was a very broad version, the broadest possible version of this law that would have said that the court cannot use the reasonableness standard in judging actions by the government or by municipal employees. It didn't go that far, but it did say that the reasonableness standard will apply to decisions, policy decisions made by the full cabinet and also by individual ministers. And it also applies to appointments. And so, that's where, for instance, the Deri thing comes in, because that wasn't a policy decision, that was an appointment. And it also applies to the absence of action. So, for instance, Yariv Levin right now, in his capacity as justice minister, has not convened the Judicial Selection Committee, which means that no new judges can be appointed to any court in Israel. There was actually a report this morning. The numbers are disputed. There was a report this morning that a few months from now, there will be 90 judicial vacancies inside of Israel. There was another report that said, no, it's not 90, it's only going to be 50. But the point is that without convening this committee, none of them can be filled. And so in the past, before the law was passed last Monday, a court could have stepped in and said it is extremely unreasonable to not convene the committee. So again, not an action that's been taken, but an action that has not been taken. That is also covered by the new law. So it's very broad in the sense of the activities that it covers. It pretty much immunizes any minister or deputy minister or government sort of central government employee from having their decisions, whether it be policy decisions or appointments, struck down by the court. And that's the new law of the land as of last Monday. So that's sort of a longer than I wanted to, but a brief-ish version of how we got to where we are.
Thank you. No, that's a really complete and kind of holistic look at the timeline and brings out a lot of elements of how the process unfolded to the events we've seen this past week. As you mentioned, when this package was announced, there was a lot of upheaval, and I think you said this is the 31st continuous week of protests. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly people are protesting and why people are in the streets in such large numbers kind of all over the country?
If you talk to people in the streets and you read the signs that people are holding up and you go to protests, and I've been at this point, I think, to 4 protests in Jerusalem and 1 in Tel Aviv. So I've gotten a decent sense of what's out there. What you will see are many Israelis who are warning about dictatorship. What they say is that if the proposals pass, and one has now passed, that it will lead Israel to no longer be democratic. Now, I think there's a case to be made that this is a bit hyperbolic, that Israel is not going to descend into absolute dictatorship. There is an argument that it will, but there's also an argument that it won't. But I think that what most people are out there protesting isn't necessarily a concern about outright dictatorship. What they are protesting is 2 things. First of all, they have a real concern about what this does to the quality of Israel's democracy. Israel is distinctive in a number of ways. One of them I already mentioned, which is that it has no constitution. Because it has no constitution, that means that rights that Israelis have are conferred almost exclusively by judicial decisions. There is no constitution, there is no Bill of Rights. There are a couple of basic laws, basic law on human dignity and liberty, basic law, the really terribly named basic law, freedom of occupation. Doesn't mean West Bank occupation, means freedom to work. These confer a number of rights on Israelis, but they don't have nearly the broad category of rights that we have, for instance, here in the United States, as protected by the Constitution. So one concern is that because there's no constitution, Israelis are overly dependent on the courts for rights and protections and liberties. And if you unilaterally curtail the powers of the court, that's going to have real impact in terms of people's rights and in terms of democracy. Second, another way in which Israel is distinctive is Israel doesn't have a lot of checks and balances that are naturally built into the system. So here in the United States, for instance, we have three distinct branches of government. We have the executive, which is the president and all the various agencies. We have the legislative, which is Congress, and we have the courts. In Israel, because it is a parliamentary system, you don't really have three branches, you have two. Because the same majority of 61 or more members of Knesset who control the Knesset, the legislature, also comprise the government. They are the ones who make up the government comprised of ministers and deputy ministers. And so the executive branch and the legislative branch are the same, as opposed to here in the United States, where the legislature acts as a check on the executive and vice versa, at least in theory, when they're held by separate parties. In Israel, you don't have that. The only check is the judiciary. And so if you weaken the powers of the judiciary, you don't have any other brakes on the system. Israel is not a federal system, so you don't have the central government and states. In addition, the Knesset is a unicameral legislature. It's only one chamber. So in the United States right now, for instance, where the Republicans control the House and the Democrats control the Senate, that's not something that can happen in Israel because there's only one chamber. And so all of the different checks that you might have built into a system, even absent the Constitution, are also not present inside of Israel. And that makes the role of the judiciary even more important. And so Israelis are worried about that as well. And lastly, there is this idea that what the government is trying to do is not a policy decision. It's not having an argument with the opposition or with protesters about foreign policy or domestic policy. It's trying to change Israel's actual system of government and institutions, what we would call first order principles when we're talking about political theory or constitutionalism. And for many of the folks in the streets, what they say is, judicial reform is needed. If you look at polls of Israelis, about 2 out of every 3 Israelis believes that there should be some sort of reform to the judiciary, that there should be some sort of rebalancing between the judiciary and the Knesset and the government. But what they're concerned about is that when you are making giant changes, not over policy, but to the system, that should not be dependent on the outcome of an election, which is supposed to decide policy, not the system. And that to do so without any buy-in from the opposition, to do so without any form of consensus, will also put Israel in a spot that looks less democratic than before. So, some folks in the streets are legitimately worried about Israel becoming a dictatorship. Some are worried about just an erosion of democracy, so that, they're worried that Israel will start to look like Turkey or Hungary, places that we call majoritarian democracies in political science. But whatever your view is, it's really, I think, these 3 broad things that people are worried about, and that's what's brought so many people out into the streets.
So I want to drill down a little bit on each of these 3. First off, talking about the role of the judiciary in conferring rights, there's some talk that has been coming up recently, particularly with the dissolution of the reasonableness doctrine, that rights, particularly for people who are more marginalized, might be infringed. So thinking like religious versus secular Jews, Arab citizens of Israel, women, LGBTQ folks, etc. Can you talk a little bit about what might happen now that if this reasonableness continues to be eliminated as a tool of the court, how might the court's power be influenced?
So I think the best way to illustrate this actually is to talk about two examples, one very recent and one from about a decade ago, where the court used the reasonableness doctrine to sort of overturn a government decision and force government action that benefited a couple of groups. The first is from about a decade ago. There was a community. Oh boy, I'm blanking on the name. But there was a community in, I think, northern Israel where members of the town wanted to build a mikvah, a ritual bath, and the religious services ministry had set aside money for the mikvah. There had been land allocated, everything was set to go, and the town decided that it did not want to build a mikvah, largely because it did not want more observant Jews in the town. The Supreme Court stepped in and said that is an extremely unreasonable decision. There are no barriers to this mikvah being built. The money is there, the land is there, everything is sort of set. The court could not, in that instance, prove outright discrimination, which was something that the right to be free of discrimination based on religion is something that is part of Israel's system of basic laws. But there wasn't a paper trail, and so it resorted to reasonableness. And in this case, that was a way of protecting the rights of observant Jewish Israelis. Another example happened just under this government, where every year on Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day, for the past decade, there has been a joint Memorial Day ceremony with Israelis and Palestinians. It's organized by a couple of NGOs, one Israeli NGO and one Palestinian NGO. And in order for that to happen, the Palestinians who are participating, who live in the West Bank, need permits to enter into Israel. And every year, those permits have been granted. This year, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant decided that he was not going to issue the permits for the Palestinian participants to come from the West Bank to Israel. And he said for security purposes, but did not elaborate. There was a petition to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court stepped in and said, given that over 100,000 Palestinians enter Israel every day with Israeli work permits, and given that the ceremony has happened every year for a decade without a problem, and given that no specific threats have been identified, that decision is deemed to be extremely unreasonable, and it ordered the defense minister to issue the permits for Palestinians to come so that the ceremony could be held as it always has. So, we see from there two decisions, one targeting observant Israeli Jews, one targeting Palestinians, where absent the reasonableness standard, these decisions would have stood. And, these are two groups that would have been harmed. Now, there are lots of examples that one can imagine. If, let's say, tomorrow, Itamar Ben-Gvir said, you know what, in my role as national security minister, I decide that there are no more gay pride parades to be held anywhere in Israel because it causes a threat to public order. Without the reasonableness standard, it would be very difficult for a decision like that to be overturned. Or if the interior minister, were to say, there's, somebody I don't like, I'm going to decide that that person cannot have an entry visa into Israel. There too, that could be a decision that targets an individual where, absent the reasonableness standard, there's really no mechanism for overturning a decision. So, one of the problems with this going forward is that many things are simply left to the discretion or good graces of not just the full government, but individual ministers. And, if it happens to be that there's a government or ministers that you like, then there may be decisions that you agree with. And if it's a government you don't like, then there will be decisions you don't agree with. But the point is that, it is very much now up to the discretion of individuals based on politics, as opposed to based on some sort of broad-based standard. And so the concern that people have is that this will be now a tool for the government to target either disfavored individuals or disfavored groups with sort of things, as I said, really depending on the good graces and goodwill of whichever minister happens to be in a position of power at any given time.
So I want to follow up on that. I think that's a really good kind of summary of how that's been used. The kind of counterpoint is that, this government, especially Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has been saying that these are necessary reforms, that this package of reforms they're putting forward are necessary reforms. And you mentioned that if you kind of surveyed the population of Israeli citizens, many people would say that some reforms are necessary. So I guess kind of a two-part question is, how does the government see the necessity of these particular reforms? And then what are maybe some different voices that would say, these are other reforms that we feel might be necessary?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll give the government's position on a number of these things. So, for instance, when it comes to judicial selection, one thing the government says is the Knesset is the democratic body of Israel. It is elected by the people. It's accountable to the people. Whereas judges in Israel, as in the United States, at least federal judges in the United States, are not elected, not accountable to anybody. They have terms that far outlast those of politicians. That is a less democratic branch, a less accountable branch. And so why is it that judges in Israel should have any role in deciding who other judges will be? Because right now on the Judicial Selection Committee, it's comprised of 9 people. 3 of those 9 are sitting Supreme Court justices, and 2 of them are members of the Israel Bar Association. So you have more members of the judiciary and legal establishment than you have elected politicians. And what the government says is that's completely topsy-turvy, right? If we want to actually be accountable, then politicians should be the ones who either entirely or have a larger say in selecting judges. The same goes for something like overturning legislation. What the government says is, over time, the Supreme Court has acquired for itself these huge powers, powers that are not written down in basic laws. The power to overturn Knesset legislation, the power, at least up until last Monday, to overturn government action that it deems to be extremely unreasonable. The same argument applies, right? That the Knesset is the more democratic branch, it's the more accountable branch. And so if you're going to have one branch that is more powerful than the other, it should be the Knesset, and it shouldn't be that not only unelected judges, but unelected legal advisors can come in and stop government action, and what they say has the force of law. So there are, and also sort of the idea that even over time, many of these things have developed, right? The Supreme Court didn't have some of these powers in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, even through the 80s, and then all of a sudden it did. And so there's an argument to be made, and I think that this is the argument that most Israelis who support some form of judicial overhaul and judicial rebalancing would say. There is an argument that the balance is out of whack and it needs to be restored. The counterpoint to that is that in many of these proposals, the government isn't actually looking to create a more healthy balance. It's looking to eliminate any balance in any check at all. So you have these competing arguments. I think one of the difficulties here is that everybody, the government in particular, but I think the protesters as well, everybody is sort of dealing in extremes, right? So the government took the idea of judicial overhaul and judicial reform, but put forward one of the most extreme possible versions of it. If you talk to the protest leaders or you listen to what they're saying from the stage at Kaplan Street every Motzei Shabbat, what they say is no reform at all. We are not going to stop until these things are completely off the table. The Judicial Selection Committee cannot be touched in any way, shape, or form. The reasonableness standard cannot be touched in any way, shape, or form. And so, you have extremism on one side. I think it's sparked some extremism on the other side. And what you're left with in the middle is this idea that judicial overhaul is something that is necessary, but the version that perhaps would make sense and would be supported by most people isn't on the table. I will note that President Bougie Herzog released a few months ago already, in an effort to sort of avert all of this, his own recommendations for various elements of the judicial overhaul. And I haven't seen polling on it, but just based on what was in them, I think that you'd probably get certainly a majority and perhaps even a supermajority of Israelis who would support the compromise proposals he put forth. But at the moment, those are a wish list from President Herzog, but they're not actually in the political sphere in a robust way.
Thank you for giving us a better look at kind of where that controversy lies. You mentioned sort of the potential for a rebalancing to actually be shifting power more squarely into the hands of the Knesset and the government. There are some who have been saying in writing that it's not really a debate between, liberal and conservative ideologies, but, kind of liberal democracy versus illiberalism versus kind of the gathering of power. How does that idea sort of factor into these negotiations around this package of reforms?
I'm not sure that it factors into negotiations, but I do think it's an accurate way of describing what has transpired. I started off by talking about Yariv Levin and Simcha Rotman. Yariv Levin has been writing now for decades, and there was actually a profile from the New York Times a couple of days ago, and people might want to check it out. He's been writing for decades, sort of against the powers of the judiciary. There's all sorts of armchair psychology, both in the Times article and kind of outside of it, about why he takes the positions that he does. But he is very much in favor of Israel as a Jewish state over Israel as a democratic state. He doesn't see these two things as being equal. He thinks one is more important than the other. And many people who look at that would say, that is an example of illiberalism, not an example of trying to strengthen democracy, but an example of trying to blunt the impact of democracy on something that he views as more important, which is Israel as a Jewish state. For Simcha Rotman, who belongs to Bezalel Smotrich's Hatzianut Hadatit party, that entire party, and Smotrich is really the key figure here, wants the judicial overhaul, not because they're interested in making things more democratic, but because they are interested in extending and hardening Israel's grip over the West Bank, annexing and applying sovereignty to the West Bank without giving Palestinians who live there anything resembling citizenship or rights of any sort. In order to do that, and again, it stems from sort of I think probably a different flavor of this than Yariv Levin, but it stems from the idea that Israel is a Jewish state and the rights of Jews anywhere in the land of Israel are more important than any other political principle. The idea behind it is that if they want to do these things, that they want to accomplish, it cannot be done without judicial overhaul. If you want to build settlements on private Palestinian land, that's something the Supreme Court has ruled multiple times cannot be done. If you want to retroactively legalize the over 200 illegal outposts, and when I say illegal, I mean illegal under Israeli law, that are in the West Bank, you can't do that if the Supreme Court is sitting in its current iteration. If you want to ultimately extend Israeli sovereignty to the West Bank and remove elements of Israel's military occupation, which have been defined by the Supreme Court as a belligerent military occupation, meaning that everything has to go through the military. If you want to civilianize those things, you can't do that with the Supreme Court that has ruled that this is a military occupation and therefore must adhere to the Geneva Convention. So, for Rotman and Smotrich and folks in his party, that is what's behind this. And so, I would argue that element is the most deeply illiberal element of all. And so I absolutely agree with the argument that this isn't actually an argument about what will make Israel more democratic. I think that, as I said before, there is definitely a version of judicial reform that would be an argument about how do we make Israel more democratic, how do we make the system better balanced. But that is not what's going on here. What's going on here, in my view, really is an argument about illiberalism versus liberalism.
So, I mean, given that these are kind of leaders in the current coalition of governments, these are points that often get brought out when you hear, kind of press releases that Prime Minister Netanyahu gives, or, other things that maybe filter out into the general American reading, viewing public. And I've actually heard it said that, Prime Minister Netanyahu kind of has used the judiciary as a sort of backstop where he knows the political situation in Israel well enough to know that he can propose these things and they can even get passed in the Knesset, but the judiciary will not allow them to actually take effect. And so he can be the voice that says, I'm trying to do the reforms that one side wants, but the other side is happy because they don't actually get passed. How do these changes kind of affect his ability to really maintain a hold on his coalition?
It's unclear whether the reasonableness law and anything else that they pass in the future is going to withstand judicial scrutiny. The court has accepted a petition against the reasonableness law. It's going to be hearing that challenge in September, and I'm sure it will issue a decision, in October or November at the latest. Excuse me. So, if the Supreme Court strikes it down, there are two questions. One question is whether the government will abide by it. Prime Minister Netanyahu has given a number of interviews to American media outlets in English over the past few days. In two of those interviews, he was asked if he would abide by a decision of the Supreme Court, and he declined to answer. Instead, what he said was that there are two principles that should not be violated. Government should always respect the courts, and the courts should not do anything to overturn basic laws. And again, the reasonableness law was passed as an amendment to a basic law. So that's what he's referring to. So that's obviously not a yes or no answer. So there's a question about whether the government will actually abide by a decision of the Supreme Court if it overturns the law. And the second question is what the government is going to do next in terms of the rest of the judicial overhaul. Prime Minister Netanyahu, as soon as the reasonableness law passed, said that he now is looking to pass other elements of the overhaul through consensus and through some sort of agreement with the opposition. But he also said that if they can't get to that agreement, they're going to move forward anyway. So there aren't good answers to either of those two questions. They're unknowables at the moment. And by the way, that's even assuming the Supreme Court strikes down the reasonableness law. I think that there are obviously different possibilities there too. It could strike it down. It could let it go through. It could narrow it. My guess is, if I were putting money on it, I would probably guess on door number 3. I think they'll probably, as a way, frankly, of putting pressure back on the government, not strike it down entirely, but narrow it. Perhaps narrow it so that it still applies to decisions of individual ministers, but not to the full cabinet, for instance. So we have to wait and see what happens in terms of what it does to kind of Netanyahu, and the sort of tactic that you posited at the beginning. We've seen for years Netanyahu try to do things that the court or other actors frustrate, and the way you laid it out is correct, right? He goes to his partners and says, "Sorry, I tried, but I couldn't do it." So, for instance, in 2017, the Knesset passed something called the Regularization Law, which retroactively legalized illegal outposts. The court immediately struck it down. And so Netanyahu, turned to his partners and said, "Sorry, I know you guys want to do this, and I tried, but the court wouldn't let me." When it comes to other issues in the West Bank, Netanyahu for over a decade, would say, "Oh, I wish I could build in E1. I wish I could build in Givat Hamatos. I wish I could build in Atarot, but sorry, the Americans won't let me. The Europeans won't let me." So he's used what we would call a two-level game in political science or in game theory. He has used these two-level games to great effect for a long time. The Netanyahu today is not the same Netanyahu of 2017 or even 2019. So whether he actually still wants those institutional and diplomatic constraints on him as a way of not having to take drastic steps while still keeping his coalition together, or whether at this point, he really wants to sort of all of the self-imposed and externally imposed shackles off of him. Really no way to say. The Netanyahu of before was, I think, fair to say, the most cautious prime minister in Israeli history in many ways. You agreed with his policies or not. And the Netanyahu of 2023, is behaving a lot differently than the previous iteration. So no way of knowing, but it certainly is the case that as these things start to pass and go through, whether Netanyahu actually wants them to pass or not, he is going to have fewer excuses for inaction when it comes to people in his coalition who are even farther to the right and who are pushing him to take even more drastic steps on a variety of measures, the West Bank included.
So we've seen all of this simultaneously unfold against, a broader backdrop of, things happening in the world. And one of the other kind of pieces of news between Israel and America is that President Herzog was just in the United States, just gave a joint address before Congress. And from the American side of things, that there was a little bit of tension and back and forth. President Biden talked about not wanting to meet with Israeli leaders and also kind of wavered on that a little bit. There were some representatives who walked out of President Herzog's address, even some representatives from here in Missouri. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more on ways in which our current American government has been interacting with the Israeli government and how that relationship going forward may or may not change.
President Biden has been trying to walk a line, and this is where he used President Herzog's visit, I think, to good effect. He's been trying to walk a line where he says the relationship between the United States and Israel, between the state of Israel, between the people, the citizens of Israel, has not changed. The U.S. stands with Israel and supports its legitimacy and right to exist and historic U.S.-Israel relationship, which is why inviting President Herzog to the White House and having him address a joint session of Congress, I think is intended to convey that message, that as someone who's a symbol of the Israeli state and somebody who is, obviously Herzog himself has a history of partisan politics, but in his current position as president, is a nonpartisan figure. It's a way of demonstrating the strength of the U.S.-Israel relationship. The flip side of that is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has very famously not been invited to the White House. When President Herzog was here, so this is already 2 weeks ago, President Biden had a call with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and after the call, there was consensus on both sides that they agreed to meet at some point. Prime Minister Netanyahu issued a readout claiming that he had been invited to the White House. President Biden and other spokespeople for the administration made it clear that he had not been invited to the White House, that all they had promised was a meeting at some place and time to be determined in the future. And so, I think the point is that President Biden is signaling his deep displeasure with Prime Minister Netanyahu over a number of issues. It's not only about judicial overhaul. It's also about Israeli policies in the West Bank. It's also about the makeup of this Israeli government, which includes ministers, most prominently Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, but not only those two, who the U.S. government does not want to deal with and finds to be beyond the bounds of what's acceptable. When now former Ambassador Nides presided over his last July 4th party at the American embassy in Israel, he purposely, I'm going to assume purposely, but certainly was conspicuous, did not invite any members of Knesset from either religious Zionism, Hatzianut Hadatit, or from Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power. So, it isn't just about Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And so there are a number of ways in which I think President Biden and also many leaders in Congress are expressing their displeasure with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, what it says about U.S.'s relations going forward, I think that depends a lot on what happens next. The U.S.-Israel relationship is obviously strong, robust, institutionalized at all sorts of levels. When it comes to things like Israel security, that is something that is not going to change anytime soon, even if Israel tomorrow cancels elections and becomes a full-blown authoritarian state. The United States obviously has relationships with authoritarian states around the world. And by the way, I should I should just note here, I'm not saying that Israel is going to be an authoritarian state. I'm just, taking an extreme example. The United States has relationships with authoritarian states all around the world, particularly in the Middle East. It has close partners who are authoritarian states in the Middle East because security interests dictate that is what is necessary. And the U.S.-Israel relationship, when it comes to shared interests and security, is way too important and way too valuable to the United States for, I think, any president to just discard it, irrespective of what is happening with Israeli policy. The strength of U.S.-Israel relations, though, is not just about that. It's about shared values. That's what makes the relationship a special and distinctive one. And that is what is at risk here. I think that, if Israel goes down in a liberal path, then 10, 15, 20 years from now, the U.S.-Israel relationship might look like the United States relationship with Egypt or with Saudi Arabia. I don't think that's something that many people would describe as a special relationship or as unshakable and unbreakable. I certainly don't think it's a relationship that most American Jews would like to see. And so, when we talk about U.S.-Israel relations going forward, is there going to be a complete rupture, a complete break? Absolutely not. I think that's a fantasy, a fantasy held by some, a nightmare held by others. But that's not going to happen. But certainly the strength and quality and tenor of the relationship very much can be affected. And, I should stress that it isn't only about judicial overhaul. As extreme as the judicial overhaul may look to many folks, I would argue that what this Israeli government is doing in the West Bank is actually even more extreme and even more revolutionary than what people perceive on judicial overhaul. So I think that there are a number of things right now that are complicating this relationship. And I don't assume that the relationship, no matter what happens in Israel, is going to continue along as it always has been. I think that, what we're seeing now really can impact it.
So I want to kind of back up just a little bit. We've seen, not only just within the protests, but also kind of wider stories of how people are within Israel are dealing with this reform package, are dealing with the protesting and some unique elements, not just the size and length of the protests, but also the fact that there have been incidents where some IDF reservists have either refused to show up for duty or threatened to show up for duty. And also hearing stories about people who have been living in Israel, maybe for generations, who are actually or considering leaving Israel over some of these, not just the reforms, but just the back and forth about the deep divide within Israel. Can you give us sort of an accurate assessment of, like, is this a huge historical anomaly that is unprecedented in Israel's history? Is this, kind of one example of ongoing tensions? How should we understand the events we're seeing play out?
Some things here are anomalous and some are not. So let's start with what I think is unprecedented, and that is the IDF reservist strike. There is, as people know, a very strong ethos in Israel about the People's Army, that you serve and you carry out orders, even if you don't agree with them politically. There have always been some people who are conscientious dissenters and don't want to serve in the West Bank. But for the most part, Israelis, no matter their politics, assuming that they're not Haredi and assuming that they're not Israeli Arab citizens, serve in the IDF and they serve where they're told and they carry out the orders that they are given. Partially that's because of this ethos. Partially it's because they have always had confidence that Israel is a system that respects the rule of law and that any orders that they are given are legal and will withstand scrutiny. What we're seeing now is unprecedented in terms of people, in large numbers, saying that they are no longer going to serve in the reserves. I also, by the way, assume, even though it's not reported, that this is taking place among career officers as well. Reservists can sign letters and sort of protest loudly. If you're a career officer, you can go to a protest and take your uniform off, but you're not going to be signing public letters. But I assume that this is not only confined to reservists. this is a huge problem for Israel. It's a huge problem in terms of societal cohesion. It's a huge problem in terms of IDF preparedness. It's a huge problem in terms of what it signals to other countries in the region, particularly to Iran and its proxies. So, this is something that we haven't seen really in Israel's history, and it's very concerning. There's some folks who, and we've seen this from some government ministers. There's some folks who place all the blame on the reservists and say, no matter what is going on, you have no right to refuse to do your reserve duty. There's some folks who blame this on the government and say, what did you expect in the face of warnings and in the face of a situation you've created where IDF reservists and career soldiers are worried about what this might mean for them going forward. If they serve and accept orders that are not democratic. I will leave it to everybody to decide for him or herself. Who they think is it wrong here, and it might not be only one side; it might be both. But certainly, the situation itself is unprecedented. And I think is creating a real problem for the state of Israel. When it comes to things like people leaving, there was a poll this week that said 28% of Israelis are considering leaving. That wasn't a longitudinal poll over time. I suspect that at any point over the last decade, you probably would have, 15% of Israelis who say that they're thinking of leaving, right? There's a reason that people talk about Berlin as the largest Israeli city in the world. Israelis, and those of us in the United States, who live in places with big Israeli expat communities. I live in one here in Montgomery County, Maryland. Know that Israelis leave a lot. So, I'm not sure that 28% number is kind of reflective of a crisis, or even or even how real it is. When it comes to things like shocks to the economy, those are at the moment a big deal, particularly in the wake of the last 15 years where Israel's economy really has exploded. But I'm not that old. I'm 43, but even I remember a time when the Israeli economy was not great. Closer to what we would today term to be an economy of the global South and kind of startup nation. So, is it a big deal? Yes, it's a big deal, but is it the first time we've ever seen lack of investor confidence in Israel? No, I don't think so. I don't mean to downplay the economic warnings. It is not a good thing from an Israeli perspective to see Moody's and S&P and Fitch and Citibank and JP Morgan all issuing warnings and potentially downgrading Israel's credit rating in the future. But if we're sort of ranking these things in terms of their seriousness and in terms of their unprecedentedness, I would say that the issue of reservists is at the top of that list.
So we just have a few more minutes, but I did want to follow up sort of on a bigger context that you had mentioned, and that's the fact that Israel is one of the very few democracies that does not have an enshrined constitution. Is there any move either right now or kind of building steam to create a constitution in Israel, and what impact would that have on how Israel life plays out and some of the divisions that we're seeing right now?
There have been efforts in the past to create a constitution. The Israeli Declaration of Independence calls for the establishment of a constitution. The Knesset itself was actually formed as a constitutional convention, a constituent assembly to write a constitution. And after a few months, when the efforts failed, Ben-Gurion said, forget it, let's just call ourselves a Knesset and start passing laws. The Knesset Constitution, Law and Justice Committee, actually, chaired by Simcha Rotman, is the legacy of that, because they couldn't just do away with the idea entirely. And so they took the idea of a constitutional convention and said, all right, now we're a Knesset, but we're going to preserve it as this committee, which is why, despite the fact that Israel has no constitution, its committee is called the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee, because it's supposed to be writing one in theory. These efforts have obviously not worked. We're 75 years down the road. Yair Lapid, the current opposition leader and the head of Yesh Atid, has said that as part of this process, he not only wants to come to some sort of agreement over the judicial overhaul, he wants it to lead to a constitution. I think that's very unlikely. Sadly, when Israel first was created and it wanted, or was supposed to have a constitution. There are a number of reasons why it was unsuccessful, but one of those reasons were deep divisions between religious and secular and over the role of religion in the state. Those divisions have not become easier. They've become much deeper and much harder to solve over 75 years. And in addition, when the state was founded, it was effectively controlled by a secular Ashkenazi elite. We now have far deeper divisions. I shouldn't say that. There were deep divisions at the time. We now have sort of more evident divisions out in the open between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, between secular and religious, between the Haredim and the non-Haredim. The role of Arabs inside of Israel is much more complicated today than it was back in 1948. So the idea that these groups, who are sort of at each other's throats on all sorts of issues of policy and identity, can just come together now in this moment, after Israel is undergoing unprecedented societal upheaval, and agree on a constitution, I think that that's a long shot. Now, there is one big thing that I think could be done and should be done, and this was actually recommended by the Ne'eman Commission back in the mid-2000s. They recommended a number of things, but one of the things they recommended was to pass a basic law on legislation. As I noted earlier, basic laws have no threshold. They are treated, they are the same as regular laws. You pass them the same way with a simple majority. They don't need an extra reading. They don't have to be confined to a certain set of topics. They don't get enacted after a certain sort of cooling off period or have to be confirmed by the next Knesset. There are all sorts of things that could be done to turn basic laws into something that actually do have real constitutional status. And if that happened, it would give them not only authority but make them harder to pass and amend, and would also, in theory, set forward the conditions by which courts could or could not review them. I think if you do that and you actually, by doing so, create a constitution based on what already exists as opposed to starting from scratch, that's something that maybe is possible in this moment, and I think would do a lot of good. But an entire constitution kind of starting from square one, sadly, I think is very unlikely.
Well, I want to keep an eye on the time. I just want to say thank you to Michael Koplow for all of your brilliant insight and for tackling what is, as you laid out, a very complicated and tangled set of issues affecting a whole number of different parts of both Israeli society and also the Jewish relationship to the state of Israel worldwide. I'm going to kind of turn things over right now to Rich Walter from the Jewish Federation of Greater Atlanta, who's going to close us out. Thank you everyone for your questions as well and for your interest. I will leave it to Rich to close us.
Thank you so much, Rabbi and Michael, for the hour really flew by. Clearly, we could spend many more hours on this topic. And I think it's really important in closing to remember something that Michael touched on in his last answer, that Israel is still a young country relative. And so some of this obviously is some of the normal growing pains. And obviously it's painful in the moment to see such division and strife within the country. But I think we're all hopeful that this will lead to some real reform in some of the ways that Michael discussed. I really want to thank our partners at the Jewish Federation of Greater St. Louis, especially Brian, for enabling us to tag on to this incredible program, and to the JCRC partners, both in St. Louis and Atlanta, for their help in putting everything together. And we hope that we will be able to continue to have more conversations like this together as partners on such an important topic that we all care deeply about. So thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and we look forward to more conversation.
Thanks, everyone.